Okay, this is the audio review for Stealing a Bag of Potato Chips and Other Crimes of Resistance by Victor Rios. Okay, so in this beginning part of the reading, he talks about his concept of misrecognition through the example of Ronnie. So Ronnie is preparing for a job interview at Caro's restaurant, and so Rios lends him a white dress shirt, tells him to wear fitted khaki pants instead of his baggy jeans, and they have this little disagreement over him wearing his Nike Air Force Ones. When Victor asks him, "Why do you want to wear those shoes?" he says, "Because professionals wear them," referring to professional athletes and musicians. So this is his first entree into this concept of misrecognition, right? So, many of the boys that Victor Rios has worked with believe that they have a clear sense of what courteous, professional, and good behavior is, but they didn't match the mainstream ideas of professional behavior. So when boys would display an interest in going legit by either getting a job or doing well in school, adults often couldn't recognize their positive attempts and therefore punish them or criminalize them. So their environment deprived them of the social and cultural capital they needed to progress in school or in the labor market. So they developed their own alternate social and cultural capital that they used to survive poverty, right? And persist in a violent and punitive social ecology. So part of this is about preventing violence, avoiding incarceration, attempting to really challenge those major institutions that deprive you of that social recognition. So there's a few different theories he looks at to understand what's going on with this misrecognition. So first is Terayasu, who has developed a framework for understanding and using the capital that marginalized communities develop as what she calls community cultural wealth. So basically saying that marginalized communities have always generated a community cultural wealth which allows them to survive and resist as they're cut off from other legitimate forms. Martin Sanchez Jankowski argues that poor people's ability to organize their social world and maintain social order as persistence. So the urban poor shape their behaviors and attitudes around making sense of and creating a social order within that marginalized context. So he calls this organic capital. This is the creative response that is used by boys in this study that develops in the midst of their blocked opportunities and criminalization. So despite their good intentions, their efforts are often not well received by mainstream institutions. So to illustrate this, he talks about Ronnie's experience about his perception of shaking a white woman's hand. So going back to, how Rios, not only did he tell him what to wear, but he helped him prepare for his job interview at Caro's. They practiced interview questions, and Ronnie dressed professionally. So Rios sat at a nearby table to watch the interview, right? Went into the restaurant with him. And he noticed that the white woman that was interviewing him kept her distance and seemed somewhat uninterested in what he had to say. At the end, he got up and abruptly left, so Rios got his food to go, and he sees another applicant come in, a white man. And she shakes his hand and smiles and acts much more friendly from the beginning than she was with Ronnie. So Rios goes outside, he talks to Ronnie, and he asks him, why didn't he shake her hand? And he said, well, you're not supposed to shake a white woman's hand. So Rios asked, where did you learn this, right? He said, well, he learned that white women are afraid of black men, so he had limited resources to show her respect. He believed not shaking her hand was being respectful, as he said that, he had had white female teachers who had told him to keep his distance. There was white women on the street who would clasp their purse when he walked by, or even white female store clerks who would watch him, nervously. So all of this socialized him from a young age to overcompensate around white women to show that he wasn't going to harm or disrespect them. So this just shows how stereotypes about black men as sexual aggressors and criminals are deeply rooted in American culture and affect us on a day-to-day interpersonal level. So he goes from job search to pirated DVDs. So Ronnie submits a dozen applications, has 3 failed interviews, and this obviously makes him discouraged. So he was asked by some of these managers if he had a drug habit or criminal background, and those things can be really frustrating and humiliating. So he gave up looking for a job, and he invested the $20 that he had in pirated DVDs. He made $50 off of that, which he then used to double down to get more pirated DVDs. And to sell them, he had to sit outside a grocery store for like 6 to 10 hours a day, making not very much money, but having a very high risk for arrest. Like a lot of the people that Rios is talking to, Ronnie takes the risk of incarceration and low wages because at least he has more control and less humiliation than he had in the legitimate job application process. So Rios sees this as a misrecognition of the young people's genuine attempts to do well in school or in the labor market, or if they're in the probation programs, because this leads to a frustration, right, where people don't see what they're doing as legitimate and they're frustrated by their actions. So instead of using their intellect and energy for productive use, they get punished and criminalized. So these young men face an exclusion from a network of positive credentials, and they lack adequate education or job opportunities. So they develop creative responses to deal with those hurdles. So this might be developing resistance identities. So this is a term that means that identities are created by subordinated or minority populations in response to oppression, right? And these identities operate by excluding the excluder. So some boys embrace criminality as a means of contesting the system that sees them as criminals. So Quinney takes this farther. He argues that poor people engage in some crimes, like theft, as acts of survival, right? In certain economic systems that leave you in need, you might need to steal to survive, right? But he also says that some poor and working class people engage in what he calls crimes of resistance, which are crimes like breaking public property as a form of protest against their economic conditions. So from the perspective of adults, these small crimes that these kids in his research studies were doing seemed really stupid, right? Like selling pirated DVDs or taking a bag of chips, right? They see kids breaking rules with a high risk of being caught with very small benefits. So they lose empathy for the kids and start to apply tough sanctions to them. So adults believe that their defiance was stupid. But to the boys, breaking the rules was resisting a system that seemed stacked against them. So then he uses the example of the stolen bag of chips. So first he talks about how Flacco is walking up the candy aisle. And he talks about it in this very performative aspect of how his body is set up. So because he's trying to give respect to the store owner, he selects the candy that he wants and then he holds it very far away from his body so that it's very clear that he's not trying to steal it, right? And then slaps it down on the counter. And the clerk is very apprehensive of them, especially youngsters, right, from the moment that they walk in. So while they're waiting in line to buy their snacks, the store owner yells at them and says he only wants 2 of the kids in the store at a time. So Mike is offended and he tells him he was going to pay, but now he's not. And he grabs a bag of chips and bails. The other kids, drop their snacks and run. And so Rios paid the 25 cents for the chips, but the owner said, cops are already on their way to arrest this boy. And the police did arrest him for stealing a bag of 25-cent chips, right? What's interesting is that this did actually change the store owner's interactions with the boys. They noticed that he stopped being as antagonistic with them, and he gave them more respect in dealings. So in Mike's worldview, he's fighting for dignity at the cost of giving up his freedom, right? And there's this frustration and a deep desire to feel respected that leads Mike to willfully expose himself to incarceration. So why he stole the chips? He didn't steal them for financial gain. He stole them in order to redeem himself from being shamed and feeling disrespected. So defiance constituted a temporary success for the boys, even if it's damaging to them, like in the example where the cop gets out of his car to talk to them, and the boys posture in response, so the cop humiliates one of the boys, who then responds by cursing at him. And the quote from the book was, "As one side moves to repress, the other moves to resist." So the boys' path seems, futile and ignorant, going down a road that's going to lead to more trouble, but it also provides them with a sense of agency and dignity against a system that wants to criminalize them. So they gain some sort of empowerment from mocking the system. They have these strategies that are obviously problematic because they're resisting by leaning into those negative stereotypes, and that has all sorts of problems for their future. So the boys are acting foolishly as a strategy to discredit the significance of a system which excludes them and punishes them. Their deviant politics frustrated police and school personnel, and this frustration led to more punishment. So this kind of reflects a deeper crisis of control within the community. The transgressions that they had, these minor breaking of rules served as a way for them to feel empowered or to take back the feelings of humiliation or stigma that they experience when they are trying to be good and they're still seen as criminal. So the meaning of breaking the rules meant resisting a system. And as they had very few resources, criminality was one of the few resources boys could use in response to criminalization, as ironic as that is.